This year, what was previously one of the best regarded Eurovision national selections of recent years fell into complete chaos. Against a backdrop of mass protests across the country, we saw almost every single interval act withdraw, a general boycott of the state broadcaster, and artists trying unsuccessfully to withdraw from the competition as well. That was followed up with the icing on the cake, a result that was almost certainly manipulated. These are just some of the incidents that rocked the Serbian national selection for Eurovision this year. This time around, the show was like no other, and not in a good way. Today, I'm going to explain exactly why that is. Quickly before we start, as always, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel as well. You can follow me and my editor Jay on social media and all the links in the description. We release a video every Friday at 7 p.m. UK time, and we live stream every Sunday night at 8 p.m. It would be great to see you there. Finally, you can support us financially on Ko-fi and on Patreon. Now we've got that out of the way, in order to understand this selection, there's some important things that we need to know first. Firstly is the political turmoil that exists in Serbia right now. Secondly is the position of the state broadcaster RTS within this turmoil. We are going to talk about the show itself, and we're going to talk about some of the songs that participated as well as the winner. But this show was totally inseparable from this context, and it's really important that we talk about it. What happened last weekend in this show all stems back to an incident back in November. In November, in the city of Novi Sad in Serbia, a train station canopy that had recently been renovated collapsed. During the renovation, the weight of the canopy was increased, and this proved to be too much for the pre-existing supports. Tragically, 15 people lost their lives in this incident. What this triggered was a massive wave of protests across Serbia, which are still ongoing to this day. While this incident was the thing that sparked them, the protests are about something far wider, which is the culture of corruption, which is now pervasive at all levels of government in the country. The government's attempts to evade responsibility for the tragedy in Novi Sad, as well as their reluctance to release documentation related to the recent renovation of the station, only served to massively escalate tensions further. Since then, a whole series of officials have resigned, including the former prime minister, but the protests are yet to subside 4 months later. This is where Serbia's national broadcaster RTS comes in. Last week we talked about Poland and the effect that the government had on the broadcaster there. The government influence meant that their actions were covered more favorably, and opposing actions and protests were either not covered at all or covered in a negative light. The same is true in Serbia, but it's much more entrenched than it was in Poland. You have a lot of the same regressive, ultra-conservative politics prevalent at all levels of the organization. In Poland, the new government has been able to rip out a lot of these issues within a few months. But in Serbia, as long as this government is in power, that isn't going to happen. The news wing of the broadcaster essentially functions as a government propaganda channel. Its output is overwhelmingly pro-regime, and its editorial teams are packed full of pro-government figures. The same goes for the directors board of the broadcaster. We're not quite in Belarus territory here, but RTS has been long criticized for more than a decade for foregrounding pro-government voices during elections, and they've come under heavy fire for this again, especially in the last 6 months, with extremely limited coverage of the protests, which didn't reflect that this is by far the biggest story in Serbia right now. This pro-government slant even found its way into the scheduling of the Eurovision selection this year. The final was moved forward from Saturday to Friday for the first time ever, because on the Saturday there was a massive protest taking place in the city of Niš. They then moved the start time of the show back 10 minutes at barely a moment's notice to instead broadcast a press conference with the president Aleksandar Vučić and his newly convicted ally Milorad Dodik, who has dedicated his entire political life to attempting to destabilize the state of Bosnia. This wasn't the only interaction that Vučić had with this show either. He previously accused the show director, Olivera Kovačević, of trying to kill him during a live interview. Unsurprisingly, Olivera has since decided to sue him. All of this paints a picture of a government that's in chaos, a country that's in chaos, and a broadcaster that is set up to parrot out government narratives uncritically. The one thing that doesn't make sense here to someone who's not familiar with the broadcaster would be, how is it that the show director can have such a spat with the president of the country and still be in such a prominent position? This mostly owes to the fact that on the most basic level, the government is far less interested in the entertainment output of the broadcaster than it is in the news output. These two sections are governed separately for the most part. That, combined with the fact that this show is really quite popular in the country, means that it's mostly ended up insulated from the political direction action of the broadcaster and the government at large. That said, being a show of the national broadcaster still means that it can't be separated entirely and that it was still a target for protesters and for boycotts. In this case, the boycott was not for people to not watch the broadcaster, but rather for public figures to refuse to appear on it. In the context of this show, it was about as successful as it possibly could have been. Every single interval act, bar one, pulled out from the show in advance, leaving us instead with montages of acts who participated in the show in previous years, as well as pre-recorded performances of Luke Black and Constructor from 2023 and 2024. This caught them so unawares that Luke Black found out that he was one of the interval acts during the show when someone tweeted at him about it. Poor Luke was sat at home enjoying an ice cream 1,000 miles away before receiving one of the most unique ice cream spoiling messages that he could possibly have received. As for who those interval acts were planned to be, a source close to the production has told me that we were meant to see Teodora, Sarajevo, Zoria, although she did still appear as a juror, Constructor, and Luke Black, as well as Bojana Staminov. Bojana was Serbia's act at Eurovision 10 years ago. The fact that there was a video in the show presenting a kind of retrospective of her time at Eurovision suggests that maybe it was meant to be bookended by a performance as well. As for the one interval act that did perform live, it was a children's choir who performed Za Milion Godina. This song is considered to be one of the anthems of the ongoing protests. Unlike the interval act, the actual performers in the show weren't able to withdraw so easily. This is because, contractually, if you withdraw without good reason after a certain point, there is a heavy financial penalty involved. To look elsewhere, another example of this might be the ongoing lawsuit between the Norwegian broadcaster and Angelina Jordan. They're seeking a really large amount of money because she withdrew at the last minute from Melody Grand Prix. Several artists in this show came forward to say they would have withdrawn if they could, but they simply couldn't afford to pay the fees if they did it. That left only one thing to do, and that was to make their stances clear on stage instead. As a result, the show was littered with subtle protests and references to what was going on in the country at large. One of the key images of the protests is the red hand. Multiple acts either displayed this symbol or made reference to it. Multiple acts held their hands up at the end of their performances to reveal that they were painted red, while others wore badges that displayed the same symbol. Some artists opted for slightly more subtle gestures, such as brandishing the book that most Serbian university students receive with all of their grades in it. Another creative solution was pumping up red balloons in the green room. One artist displayed a message on their phone that said, "It's not artistic to be silent." In the final, that same artist, Tam, took it a step further. When she was asked by the host what she would be doing after the competition, she said that she was going to visit relatives in Niš and that she would see everybody there. Niš was the location of a huge protest that took place the following day. The most audacious protest action, though, was from the band Ohio. In both their semi-final and final performances, they displayed messages on screen in support of the protests. These messages included their walking from city to city, which refers to the so-called walking protests, where large groups of people literally walk from city to city, and they also displayed the messages, "Freedom is spreading and we are not staying silent." At first, their performance was uploaded to YouTube, but then it was quickly removed and replaced with rehearsal footage without those messages instead. This immediately generated uproar, and as a result, the original performance was reinstated. The show director claimed that there were technical difficulties, and that was the reason for the switch. Realistically, this seems like a pretty unlikely excuse. Finally, during the voting sequence of the show, one of the jurors said that students are our strength, our future, and our brains. One of the hosts audibly groaned when they said this. Her colleague claimed that she'd simply dropped her microphone, but nobody was buying this either. Through all of these various incidents, what you ended up with was a show completely mired in controversy. But interestingly, for the most part, a show that accepted that artists would express their political beliefs, and perhaps foreseeing yet more problems if they took any action, chose to simply let it happen. In advance of the event, the show's director openly acknowledged this. She said that, "We organised the selection in specific social circumstances, and we are aware that a large part of our audience is on the streets, as well as parts of our performers. Due to obligations and contracts with our contestants and with Eurovision, as well as our relationship with the audience and fans, we will do our best to make the festival go smoothly. We understand everyone, and we don't hold anything against anyone. The show is not separated from our society and the situation in our country, so we also share the fate and feelings of our citizens. For years, this festival has been a place where artistic creation, freedom of expression, and freedom of choice are demonstrated, and we will fight to keep it that way. Hopefully all of that gives you a pretty good idea of how controversial this show was, but also interestingly how the show allowed, to a very great extent, the artists to simply express themselves. That is a lot of context for a national final, but hopefully it illustrates just how controversial this show was this year, as well as showing the weird and very unique place that it has within the host broadcaster and within Serbian society. Amid all of that backdrop, it's time to talk about some of the songs from the show. We'll also talk about the blatantly manipulated televote, as well as the winner's chances at Eurovision. We're going to start with someone particularly unhinged in the form of Maja Nikolich, with her song Žali srce moje.
Žali srce moje, žali će i tvoje, žali srce moje, žali će i tvoje.
Maja did not even make it to the final of this show. She is in this video because she has the dubious honor of potentially being the most insane participant in any national selection anywhere this year. Before the show, at least initially, she was being friendly to her fellow contestants. She singled out Mimi Mercedes, Harem Girls, and Prince for particular praise. We'll talk about all of them in a moment. After the show, things took a dramatic turn though, and she said some of the most extraordinarily offensive things I have ever heard any national final participant say about their fellow contestants. The one who got off most lightly was Prince, who she simply said wouldn't qualify for the final at Eurovision, that his victory had humiliated Serbia, and that she'd be supporting Croatia instead, despite the fact Croatia had not selected their entry at this point. Mimi Mercedes, meanwhile, went from being one of Maja's favourite to being disgusting, ugly, and fat. That said, neither Mimi nor Prince were as much a target of Maja's ire as Harem Girls were. Harem Girls, for context, are a group of drag queens. For whatever reason, Maja went into an interview and called them weird 140-kilogram men with huge lashes, before thanking God that her sons were healthy and not they them. She then kept digging, saying, "Let's not let ourselves be embarrassed by representatives of shady qualities, shady morals, drug abusers, some weird they-thems, its, or freaks," before going on to say, "You want to send transgender people? Okay, make them hit the gym and lose 40 kilograms. She then helpfully clarified that she wasn't homophobic because her stylist and her hairdresser were LGBT. In addition, they have sleepovers at her house. She then put the icing on the cake with an absolute corker of a closing statement. "I don't mind a gay winning, but let it be dignified." She didn't stop at personal insults either, claiming that she was bigger than the broadcaster, and as a result, they felt threatened by her. She said she had received 95% of all the votes in the show, and claimed to have received those votes from Australia, Los Angeles, San Diego, Germany, Sweden, and Brazil. Finally, in a moment you'd think would trigger some self-reflection, she said that homophobia was outdated and belongs in the 90s. Based on what we've just gone through, either Maja is living in the 90s as well, or alternatively she finds homophobia, and fatphobia for that matter, much more fashionable than she is letting on. Unrelated to that, but also worth mentioning, is the fact that she performed with a cast on her foot after she broke it in rehearsals. Allegedly, this happened when she attempted a backflip during one of the run-throughs of her performance. I'm not kidding. Some of you may be wondering if I'm actually going to analyse her song. The good news for you is, yes, I am. It was bad. Let's move on. Next up is Mimi Mercedes. She was participating with her song Turbo Žurka. We really are going from one hot mess to another here, and unfortunately this one was also my favourite song of the selection, despite the fact that the live performance was a total mess. Mimi Mercedes was one of the favourites to win the show in advance, and she was particularly favoured to be strongly performing with the televote. That's because she was already a well-known name in Serbia. Unfortunately, this turned out not to be the case. Like I said, I really like this song, and I kind of found the fact that it was such a hot mess to be kind of endearing. Unfortunately, I don't think most people share that opinion. This outfit is kind of giving Overwatch for some reason, and as a result, it feels more like she's gearing up to participate in an esports tournament than go to Eurovision. More egregiously, whoever choreographed this performance did her so dirty. This is such a high-energy song that it makes no sense that Mimi is mostly static. Even in the dance break, there was hardly any movement at all, whether from the dancers or from Mimi herself. It's such a shame, because I'm sure you could have done something more energetic here. But for whatever reason, that just wasn't forthcoming in this performance. Given the fact that I thought the selection as a whole was pretty poor quality, I still had reasonably high hopes for Mimi. In the end, she crashed to a 4th place finish in the televote and 5th overall. Next, we're talking about the big fan favourite, and that was Harem Girls with their song Aladdin.
I umeša prste da ti greje dlano dok se drugi krste.
One of the most interesting threads in this competition in recent years is the way in which it has been an opportunity for LGBT voices and performers to still have a foreground, even in a country and on a broadcaster that have a pretty conservative slant. Last year, I talked about this at length with reference to Koyeta Žena by Filari. This year, Harem Girls took up a similar mantle to much greater success. This group consists of 6 drag queens, and as far as I can tell, they're essentially singing a song about how much of a two-timing scumbag Aladdin is, and how he led on 5 of them before running off with Jasmine in the end. Unsurprisingly, as we saw with Maya Nikolich's reaction to them after the show, this caused a lot of stir in Serbia. But as we're about to see, in all likelihood, without any SIM card and voting manipulation, they probably would have won the public vote. The song itself is a fairly standard electronic pop song with some Eastern influences, with each of the members having vocals in different parts. The standard here was definitely varied, but it came together to give a convincing enough performance. I could have seen it at Eurovision with a couple of months of polish and a better TV production around them. I would say that it does still feel slightly disjointed, and in particular, the introduction of the 6th member of the group in the bridge didn't feel like it gelled very well with the rest of the performance. It just kind of happens without any lead-in. As a result, the reveal wasn't foreshadowed enough and wasn't done dramatically enough for it to make any sense. Overall, though, I did appreciate this, and while it wasn't my personal favourite, I would have been happy to see it at Eurovision. Just before I mentioned that they would have won the public vote if it weren't for some clear manipulation. That's all down to the 2025 Eurovision SIM card farm king and queen, David and Bojana, with their song Šesto Čulo. This is a fairly middle-of-the-road pop song. It's quite fun and it's performed reasonably well, but none of those are the reasons why it's in this video. This is one of the most blatant cases of vote farming that I have ever seen. The video of the final performance of this song on the official Selection YouTube channel is only just approaching 40,000 views, almost a week after the show. So I would love for someone to explain to me how this got 33,000 votes from the public, more than double the amount that anyone else got. Luckily, I do think I can explain it. Posts appeared in Facebook groups in Serbia advertising some kind of work involving non-political voting on the night of the show, as well as this leaked text message detailing a vote farming operation taking place at the Hotel Prestige in Belgrade. This is a hotel that is owned by Bojana's father. For context on the number of votes this received, we are operating in the league of Constractor, who was a viral sensation, and Hurricane, who at the time were one of the most famous groups in Serbia. This is so blatantly obvious that I'm genuinely really surprised that Bojana and David have come out since the show and claimed that there was no funny business. The entire comment section of the video of this performance is packed full of Serbians calling them out for what they see. A personal favourite of mine of this one, which translates broadly to, if you got 33,000 votes, I will eat 33,000 shits. Regards. Something has to be done about this before next year, because if even Moldova is able to implement things to stop this from happening, Serbia can do it too. It is very easy to see if there is a SIM card farming operation taking place at a single location. That's because you can work with the mobile networks and see that there is a disproportionately high number of votes coming through a single cell tower. Once you've identified this, you can simply disqualify all of the votes coming from that cell tower, and the operation is rendered useless. Alternatively, just abolish SMS voting altogether and do what many national finals do, where you vote via an app. If you tie the votes to verification through a credit or debit card, it makes it much, much harder to manipulate the results. We are now going to talk about the winner, but one quick thing before I do. There's been some discourse that Harem Girls would have won this show had it not been for the vote manipulation of Bojana and David, but that is actually still not true. The winner of this show finished 3rd in the televote, so had Bojana and David not got the 12, then the 2 songs below them would have both gained 2 points. As a result, while both Prince, who I'll talk about in a moment, and Harem Girls would have gained 2 points each, the result would not have changed. As I said, the winner of the show was Prince, who no one saw coming with his song Mila. Honestly, this was a fitting way for this show to end, with a winner that no one saw coming, and that is a shadow of past years for reasons both in and out of the broadcaster's control. This song scored 10 from the juries and 8 from the public, making it a kind of compromise winner that as a result nobody in Serbia is particularly happy with. It is seriously difficult to find even one Serbian who is happy about this winning. And if you look in the comments section of the video on YouTube, they include people celebrating that they've given the rest of Europe a 3-minute toilet break during the show, as well as another one that I particularly enjoyed that read, "At least now I know how the Poles felt when Jan lost." The 8 points that this song received from the public would also feel a little suspicious, given the fact that the day before the show, this only received 610 streams on Spotify. There was no hype for this whatsoever, and while some manipulation was possible, it's also worth noting that a wide-scale boycott from younger people of the show this year was always going to give more power to the kinds of voting segments that are more likely to enjoy a ballad like this. In terms of the song itself, this is a by-the-book Balkan ballad that doesn't really go anywhere and follows the same game plan that was much more successful 15 years ago. The staging is kitsch and overdramatic, and the sudden appearance of a fast-spinning woman in the final minute just makes the whole thing feel a little bit silly. I do not think that Serbians are going to be at all surprised by my prediction for how this is going to end up for Prince at Eurovision. Unfortunately, it's very close to dead on arrival. Even with the best possible staging, this song is simply too weak to realistically challenge for a place in the final. To be honest, I think this is more likely to finish last in the show than it is to finish in the top 10. All of this for me reflects a real sadness that what was previously one of my favourite national selections has fallen so far in such a short time. What's most concerning to me is that these songs were submitted before the protests started. That means that this was simply the quality available this year, and it's a massive jump down from what we saw in previous years. I really hope we'll see a bounce back next year because, to be honest, every single song in the top 5 last year would have landslid in this show. They would have won without a major problem. Ultimately, though, the number one thing that would make this selection more healthy is a genuinely editorially independent broadcaster which isn't constantly under the influence and pressure of the government. The thing that is damaging the broadcaster at large, as well as Serbian society on the whole, is a culture of corruption and democratic backsliding that this government is actively encouraging. This is a sad place to end the video, but overall this show was genuinely one of the most interesting for me to analyze this year. Not because of the songs, of course, but because the context is so unique. The way in which this show was simultaneously boycotted by a lot of public figures and not watched by a large number of young people who would usually engage with it for that same reason, while simultaneously becoming an outlet for protest for artists, is really fascinating. I really hope that things get better in Serbia and that the protesters are successful in their aims. So this kind of video is not necessary again, but I really hope I've been able to give you a bit of a window into how we ended up in this position. I'm going to close up with one small anecdote that I think pretty much sums up the situation of the broadcaster and the show in relation to the government. Once all was said and done, one of the directors of RTS reported the show to the EBU because it was political. In response, the show director, Olivera Kovacevic, simply said in the media he should get a life. With that, it's time to finish this week. I'm sure there are going to be more chapters to this story, and next year's show will surely be influenced by how these protests conclude, whether that's in a positive way or a negative way. I'm sure I'm going to end up talking about it in any case. But for now, please do like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed the video, and I'll look forward to seeing you again in 7 days.